We're so glad you're here. We are especially grateful to our sponsors today, Hillside Memorial Park and Mortuary, for bringing us this incredible series. This third session of this three-part series is going to be the highlight. Not that everyone wasn't, but we're with one of my dearest friends and my rabbi, Ed Feinstein. Welcome, Eddie. I'm so happy you're here, Rabbi Feinstein. So before we even get started, we want to share a few words from Hillside and let you hear why they're so invested in sharing this Torah with you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rafael Ochoa, and I'm the General Manager of Hillside Memorial Park and Mortuary. Some of us, if not all of us, have heard the words, "It takes a village." And to all of us at Hillside, this speaks to the importance of community. Support, respect, and tikkun olam. These are just a few of Hillside's deeply rooted core values. As a member of the Los Angeles Jewish community, Hillside Memorial Park and Mortuary has been proud to partner with the American Jewish University for 35 years, supporting and encouraging programming for continued Jewish education in the Los Angeles area, and now with Maven throughout the world.
I'm Mari Chernow, Senior Rabbi at Temple Israel of Hollywood. On behalf of Hillside and AJU and TIOH, we're so glad that you're taking the time for this important series. Judaism is a life-loving religion. We affirm life, we celebrate life, we enjoy life. One of the parts of life is the reality of death. It's difficult to talk about. Whatever your Jewish background, we're so glad that you're here to deepen your understanding of this important topic so that we can all be prepared and think about how we want to face the end of life.
On behalf of myself, the entire Hillside Memorial Park and Mortuary staff, the Temple Israel of Hollywood community, including the Hillside Council of Directors, we are proud to support this program and extend our gratitude to Rabbi Sherre Hirsch and Rabbi Ed Feinstein for this presentation. May you and your generations to follow share in the love of family and tradition.
Thank you so much, Rafael Ochoa and Rabbi Mari Chernow, for those beautiful words. We are indebted to you after 35 years of support. This series just continually resonates for people. And I'm so moved because we've heard from so many of you that this series has given you the courage to have difficult conversations with your loved ones. It's given you the courage to say things that are hard, and it's really helped you navigate. And today will be no different. Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who will be joining us in a moment, is not only a rabbi of true notoriety. He's been the senior rabbi of VBS for the past 30 years. He's an author, a teacher, what I call a rabbi's rabbi. He and I do a podcast every week, which has become the highlight of my week. He is a dear friend. He's my kids' rabbis. He's bar mitzvahed my kids, and that doesn't make him famous, but when you say his name, people are literally like, "Oh, Rabbi Feinstein," and it's truly merited. Welcome, Rabbi Feinstein. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Sherry. Thanks for having me.
I'm so thrilled. So I want to dig right into it. As you know, we had our first session with Rabbi Steve Leder, and we really talked about preparing for death. How do you write an ethical will? And he wrote a book on it. And how do you talk about it? And then we had a session with Rabbi Elliot Dorff to talk about all the ethical issues that are around death and how to deal with them. And today I wanted to do a real deep dive. You've done 30 years of funerals. So guesstimate for me, how many funerals, how many people have you been with as they've navigated this journey through burying a loved one?
I've been with many of them, but every single one of them is unique and every single one of them is different. So the answer is just one, just the very next one that asks me to join.
Of course, that you only say the one. So with all of this experience behind you, and even though the person in front of you is the only person, what do you see as the most difficult thing people come up against when they come to you saying, "I have a loved one that's dying"?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, of course. And it's a circumstance that every one of us is going to face at some point or another in our lives. Look, the the Torah teaches us that when God created us, God put us into bodies, and bodies are made of stuff, and all stuff breaks. That's the, excuse me, the second law of thermodynamics of the great Rabbi Isaac Newton. All stuff breaks. All higher order systems devolve into lower order systems. So we are made out of bodies. And so we are vulnerable to disease, to aging, to accidents, to exigencies. The great problem is that there is a fundamental contradiction within the human condition. The human soul is infinitely precious. And to our loved ones, to the people we care for, their wisdom, their love, their memories, the experiences we've shared, these are absolutely powerful, absolutely precious, cherished by us. But the body is vulnerable. The body is fragile. The body is weak. And what happens as a loved one is dying is we face that contradiction head on. How can it be that a person who has shared so much of themselves with me in the course of their lives, how can it be that a person who has shared wisdom and love and support and humor, how can it be that so many memories we hold together, how can that be contained in a container which is so fragile, so breakable?
Is this why people don't want to talk about it until it's absolutely necessary?
Of course, it's absolutely impossible to face that contradiction without becoming terribly sad. It's so very difficult to face the idea that a loved one who has been so fundamental to my being, to my identity, to who I am in the world, and has given me so much love and support, can be taken from me by something as prosaic and silly as a heart attack, as cancer, as aging, as a stroke. And so we look away. And what makes it worse, of course, is that, well, once upon a time, everybody was born at home and died at home. And so we grew up seeing this. But now we live in a culture, first of all, we live a lot longer. But more than that, these things happen outside of our eyesight. Kids are born in hospitals and folks die in hospitals. And so we don't see it. And so it's perfectly possible for adults, and I've met many of them, to reach their middle age without having ever encountered death, without ever having really thought about it, without ever having experienced the death of a loved one, of loss of a loved one. And so it comes as a shock. Look, it's always a shock to lose a loved one. But if you have no experience with this, it comes as a terrible emotional blow and a terribly confusing event. And so we wander looking for some guidance, show us what to do. It's nothing like television. I have to convince people of this. On television, death is either romantic and clean, or it's violent and horrifying. But real death is not horrifying, and it's certainly not clean. It's just sad to lose that person who has given me life, who has shared my life, who has protected me in life, who has been with me. It's so very difficult and so very sad.
And yet you, in your 30 years as a rabbi, have really made it a mission to talk about death in a much more, like, you've talked about preparing for death, buying your plots. You've talked about it in sermons. Is your mission to really get us to be much more comfortable with talking about what does it mean to die and how do we deal with it? Or am I just projecting that?
Well, there's two things. One is you listen to that beautiful introduction from Rabbi Chernow, who talks about Judaism as a life-affirming faith. You don't hear a lot of sermons about death in synagogue. Even when Yizkor comes and we're remembering loved ones, we very rarely speak about this. But because the Jewish tradition is so life-affirming. But there is one note within the tradition. It's a line in the book of Psalms. Teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. We have to remember that not one of us has an infinite number of tomorrows. And for that reason, every today is important. Every relationship is important. Every moment of discovery is important. Every opportunity to live and to love and to give and to help and to heal is important. So to talk about death is a way of focusing our attention on the premier preciousness of life and the importance of today, of each day. That's the first reason. The second thing is, as you said, because there are certain ways to think about life and to think about death and to prepare for death that ease it a little bit. One of the simplest ways is to get cemetery plots. I have been with families at the moment of crisis when a loved one dies, and they have no idea what to do. But more than that, they have to face this terrible decision. Where do we bury this person? How do we bury this person? How much it costs? How we're going to do this? If you've sat and thought about this stuff a little bit, I'm sure Rabbi Leder spoke in his session about ethical wills and preparing. If this has been thought about and prepared for, it makes the whole process so much easier, because then I can face my loved ones and spend my time with them. And I don't have to go through the business. And that's what it is, a business transaction of obtaining a plot and taking care of arrangements. So it
that's
makes
where I
it
really
so much easier.
That's where I really wanted to go today. And by the way, there's such a comfort I have with Eddie. I talk over him, so please forgive me. But
We're
that's
family.
really-
We're family.
yes, we are family. You know, that's where I really want to go today. A person's listening today and they have a dying parent, or they're just a young person and they have no illness and they want to transmit this conversation. So do you sit at the Shabbos table? What does it look like? Do you say, by the way, I heard Rabbi Feinstein today talk about preparing, and I think we should all buy plots. How, as you as a rabbi, would guide people to start having these conversations long before you need them?
That's a very important question. That's the consciousness. So to begin with, I think it's important. I'm sure you spoke about this with Rabbi Leder.
Don't even worry, because we have new audience, we have
I know.
returning audience,
But
and if you
I
hear
think
it more
it's-
than once, it's good.
Medical science today can almost do miracles. It's the almost that drives us crazy.
Mhm.
Because what happens is that a loved one reaches the end of their life and the doctors tell us, do this, do that, and we don't know what to do. And most of all, we don't know what our loved one wants us to do. There's a very painful statistic that 75% of us say we would prefer to die at home, surrounded by loved ones, in the comfortable bed that we live in. And yet only 25% of us actually die at home.
Well,
Most of us die in hospitals under cold fluorescent lights on top of cool, crisp hospital sheets, and not surrounded by the loved ones that we care for, but surrounded by medical technology and medical technicians. So the first thing is to talk about, here's what my life is. And what if I'm debilitated? What if I'm in trouble? What would I like you to do? There's a wonderful, wonderful book by Atul Gawande, who's the great writer, the medical writer of New Yorker, called Being Mortal. And it's a very important reflection. And if you don't want to read the whole book, just look up the article that he wrote, that he based the book on. It's in the New Yorker. And he tells the story of a doctor. She's actually a palliative care doctor. She deals with people at the end of life. Her father's a professor at Berkeley, and they had this conversation. And he had to have a very important medical procedure. And he had told his daughter, if I can eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on TV, keep me alive. Otherwise, don't. He had to go for a medical procedure. The doctors asked the daughter, what should we do? She asked them, will he be able to eat ice cream and watch football? They said, sure. He had the medical procedure. He lived 5 more years, wrote a couple of more books. And then it happened again. And this time she knew what to do. We have to tell our loved ones, tell them, here's what I want you to do for me. Here's what my life is. Here's when I want you to fight for me. And here's when I want you to let me go. I've told my children, I actually gave this as a sermon to my synagogue, that for me, the greatest thing I love to do is to sit with kids and tell stories. And the day that I can't do that, if I become so medically debilitated that I can't do that, that's when you can let me go, and do it with a full heart and don't be afraid. But until then, let me do it. So that's the first piece.
Good.
That's
And
the
that's
medical
giving
directive
dignity
part.
to the person, that medical direction.
Absolutely.
Good.
The second thing is, we're all going to die. I wish it were different, but that's the truth. And when it happens, I don't want to burden with my family with all of the business of the thing. So I went out to a cemetery near me and I purchased plots, and I gave the cemetery people enough money and my instructions about how I would like to be cared for. And I wrote a letter to my kids. And I said, when the time comes, you call this number, you tell them who it is, and I have left enough money that you can bury mom and me and go out to a nice Chinese restaurant and have dinner. If
Okay,
you
they're
do
not
what
going
I
to a
tell you
Chinese
to
restaurant
do."
after,
Oh,
but
yes,
okay.
they will. But I told them, if you spend a penny more on anything, that's on you. This is what I want. And I told them what I want. And I told them how I want it done. And that way there's no ambiguity. And they'll decide what they're going to do at the time, but they're going to know exactly what would make mom and me happy. And
So
I
let's
think having that conversation, making those arrangements, putting up those funds so the kids don't have to pay for it. I don't want it coming out of my grandchild's college fund or great-grandchild's college fund. And by doing that, I have put them in a position where they can take care of that crisis when the moment comes.
So I love that, because what you're really talking about is empowering the people that love you to give you dignity, but also them dignity, so they're not at odds with one another. I think dad would have wanted this. I think mom would have wanted this. So let's walk through a scenario, which I really wanted to do today, which is, a family's just had a death. And literally they've notified you that that's imminent. Maybe it just happened, but now they have a deceased person. What do they do first? Do they call the mortuary? Do they call you? Walk us through the process.
Yeah, I will help a family if we talk before the person has passed away. I can help them get ready. And what I will tell them to do is, if the person dies in the hospital, of course, you're going to have the medical staff right there. If the person dies at home, if you have hospice care for your loved one, call the hospice people right away. They will send a nurse or a doctor. It's necessary to have what's called a death certificate prepared. If the person doesn't have hospice care and dies at home, believe it or not, you have to call the police, because there has to be a very cursory and quick investigation to make sure that there's no foul play in order for the body to be taken from the home. And that's what you do first. The second
So
call you
good. Let's
make,
just recap that for a second. So if you have hospice, you call hospice. If you don't have hospice, you need to call the police to make sure there's an investigation. And you can always call your clergy way ahead of time to
anytime.
help them walk you through the ethical will, purchasing property, getting your site ready. You can always do that ahead of time. You don't always have that time ahead, but
Right.
if you don't,
And
then
at that
you know.
moment, when the loved one dies, if you really don't know, and you have a rabbi or a minister, someone who's caring for you, call that person. People call me all the time and they say, Papa, Mama just died. What do I do?
Do
So
they
I
call you
say,
in the middle of the night?
middle of the night, and it's fine if you do. Please don't call me in the middle of the night because you're unhappy with your child's bar mitzvah date. Okay. Or you don't like my
Especially if it's
sermon,
in 2028.
or you don't like my sermon. But if a loved one dies, please call me. I would much rather speak to you 3:30 in the morning and bring you peace and strength than hear later that you didn't know what to do and didn't know who to call. My phone is on all the time, and every clergy person feels that way. You
I was
call
going to
your
say, I've gotten
synagogue.
those calls in the middle of the
Right.
night, and they are an honor for
If you
me.
don't know your clergy person's phone number, call the synagogue, call the church, call your mosque, call where you normally call, and there will be a recording that tells you, in case of emergency, dial this number, and someone will connect you with your clergy person. And then I will tell them, do you have hospice care? Well, then call the hospice nurse right now. If you don't, here's the phone number of the local police department. It's the non-emergency number of the police. Sometimes you call 911, and you tell them what it is.
When
And
do you call the mortuary?
Now, that's the second call you make. You see, the mortuary is going to get on the line and they're going to say, where are you? And did the person have hospice care? They're going to want to know if you made that first call. Then you call the mortuary and you say, I'm calling on behalf of so-and-so, and our loved one has just died. We have plots and we'd like you to handle the mortuary arrangements. Could you send someone to pick up the body? And they'll ask you some questions about the name of the person and the plots. And they'll ask you about the medical thing, about whether there's a doctor who assigned the death certificate or whether you've called the police department or not. They'll ask you those questions. That's the second call you're going to make. But assuming that you've made arrangements in advance, which makes it so much easier, you'll say, I'm calling on behalf of so-and-so. They've just passed away. We have plots. We'd like you to handle the mortuary. We have arrangements with you. And they will send a vehicle. It's a small van with a couple of very sensitive people The people who do this are angels. They'll come to your home. They'll very carefully prepare the body, put it on a gurney, take it out to the car. They'll be very gentle, give you time to say goodbye, and they'll take the body to the mortuary.
And are there any special rituals you need to do while you're waiting for the gurney to arrive?
There is a tradition of reciting Psalms. I tell people you can recite Psalms, you can recite prayers. I think it's better just to talk to your loved one. There is a tradition of folklore that the soul of the person remains in the room for some time before the body is removed. So I think it's a good idea to talk to mom and to talk to dad and to tell them what any mother or father wants to hear. We're okay. We'll be okay. You can go on your journey now. And the grandchildren will be okay. And remind them how much they mean to you, how much you love them, how much important they are to you. Remind them of the significance and importance of their lives, but give them permission to take the journey to the next world.
So the mortuary comes like Hillside. I love what you said. I didn't want to cut you off. To give them permission to go to the next world. I really didn't want to cut you off. Forgive me. I just get so excited when I'm sitting with you.
I know.
But the mortuary comes like Hillside, and these incredibly kind people come. They take your loved one out on a gurney. And then what happens to your loved one, and what are you supposed to be doing?
Okay, so the loved one is going to go to the mortuary. Now, let me make something very clear. There are two institutions. One is called a mortuary, and one is called a cemetery or a memorial park.
And nobody knows the difference between these two.
Yes, I know. The mortuary is an institution that prepares a body for burial and conducts a service, helps to conduct the service. The cemetery is the place that owns the land and prepares the grave and prepares for the burial. Here in Los Angeles, there are mortuaries attached to cemeteries. So Hillside Memorial Park is a mortuary and a cemetery in one institution. Mount Sinai Memorial Park is a mortuary cemetery. Groman Eden is a mortuary cemetery. But there are mortuaries which are not attached to cemeteries and will bury people in any cemetery. Malino is one here in Los Angeles. There's one here called Chevra Kadisha. That's a little obscure because that's also the generic word for the burial society, but there's an organization called Chevra Kadisha, which is a mortuary. In other cities around the country and around the world, mortuaries and cemeteries are separate. The mortuary is a separate company than the cemetery. So you have to make 2 phone calls and make sure that both of things get communicated. The mortuary is going to take your loved one, and then according to the instructions that you've left, or according to the conversation you have with them, they will prepare the body. Now, there is a procedure called traditional Jewish burial, and that involves a preparing of a body in a very particular, traditionally sanctioned way, where the body is carefully washed by people who have learned how to do this meticulously and respectfully, that the body is washed, the body is dressed in simple shrouds, the body is placed into a particular kind of casket. Jewish tradition indicates that a casket should be made out of wood without nails so that the entire thing can become part of the earth.
And why is that?
Because because we come from the earth and we return to the earth. And anything that impedes that process is not allowed in Jewish tradition. So a very simple casket, a very simple wooden casket. Now, these days, if you go to a cemetery, there's all kinds of caskets. Some of them, some of them are very simple, and some of them are very complicated, and some of them are outrageous, right? My family's tradition, my father would say to me, I don't want to be buried in anything nicer than I owned when I was alive, right? So he would say, bury me in a refrigerator box. And I say, no, Pop, you can't do that. We'll put you in
But sometimes you plan for something and then you go to the mortuary while the body is being prepared. And like, I know for my family, and I would love to hear your opinion on it. Like, we got the giggles a little bit because I was like, we need the fancy pillow. My mom said she wanted a plain pine box, but I feel like she needs something for her head. That it's okay to have those emotions, especially because when you go to the mortuary, right? So the body's being prepared. And then what are you doing during that time?
Well, I want to finish that thought.
Please.
Look, at that moment, if you have to go shopping for a casket, it's a difficult thing to do
Correct.
because you can't help but want to push away the reality of death. And that's why people sometimes spend enormous amounts of money on very, very fancy caskets that we really don't need, because it's somehow we're resolving unresolved feelings of guilt or shame or bad or grief, and there's all this emotion involved. That's one of the reasons why making these arrangements in advance spares your family from that problem. You giggle. It's comical. I mean, I hate to say this because I don't want anybody to feel like I'm making fun. I'm certainly not, but it's comical. There are caskets, believe it or not, that have built-in stereo. I mean,
I've never seen that, but I think your point is well taken. This is another way to emphasize, and why we're doing this series, how important it is to prepare. My mother was very clear, pine box, Jewish tradition. And so even though we had that moment, we'd already made those preparations, right? And so that eliminates then my brother and I sitting there saying like, well, we just were enjoying the pillows. There was a hot pink one and whatnot. So we were.
Your mother would have enjoyed that. I know that.
My mother, right? I'm saying my mother would have enjoyed it, but
what's happening at the next thing is that you call the cemetery, the mortuary rather, and you make an appointment to speak with one of the directors or the family counselors. And they will ask you a series of questions of how you want them to prepare the body, if this has not yet been designated. And then you work out what kind of funeral you'd like to have for your loved one. And then if you have a clergy person, a rabbi, a cantor, a minister, a priest, someone who's going to perform the service, the funeral director will call that person and try to book the time so we can agree upon a time. Question of how notices are sent out to the community, whether you want an obituary printed in the newspaper or a notice sent out by the cemetery, by the mortuary rather, or notice sent out by your church or your synagogue or your mosque. I mean, these are the kinds of things that happen in the interim between the death of the loved one and the time that we bury them. These are the arrangements that are made.
And also you're making all these tactical arrangements, but you're also having a lot of emotions.
Right.
At that moment, you just said the soul remains for a period of time, but then it goes on. What are you thinking? What are you supposed to be doing? And what if you're thinking about, oh my God, I don't know where they go? Can you talk to us a little bit about what happens to them and what happens to you?
This is the advantage of having a relationship with a clergy person. And I say this frequently to my congregation and to my friends. You have a family doctor. Why a family doctor? So that when you get sick, the person who you speak to and the person you go see and the person who's going to touch you and guide your healing is familiar with you and your family and your condition and your emotions. You need a family rabbi, a family minister, a family priest. Because when you call me and I know you, we've spent time together. We've been at moments of happiness. We've been at moments of sadness. I know how to guide you through this. And you can open up to me emotionally. I'm not a stranger to you. One of the hardest things rabbis, cantors, ministers, priests have to do is when a family we're completely unfamiliar with calls us to help us with this kind of moment. They are at this emotional crisis. We don't know anything about them. I don't know how to speak to them. I don't know exactly what they need at this point. I can try and be polite and courteous and empathetic and open, but it's so much easier if I know you. It's so much easier if we've been familiar. So go get to know I always invite people to lunch. If you'll eat tuna salad, I'll take you to lunch on Ventura.
Okay, you eat sushi. Forget the tuna salad. You eat sushi.
You're in a fancier neighborhood. All right, so here's what happens. At this point, there's a process that begins. When we suffer a crisis, a loss, we enter into a psychological process called grief or grieving. Now, the word grieving or grief in English means deep sadness, but in psychology, it's a technical term referring to a psychological process that's actually a healing process. Our soul has been wounded. Our emotional being has been wounded, has been hurt, has been attacked. And so there is a healing process built into the human psychology. The first piece of the healing process is called denial. Now, denial is not a bad thing. it actually gives us the capacity to make all these arrangements. Because if you're losing it emotionally, it's really hard to call the cemetery and decide you want this or this. You want it on Tuesday or on Wednesday. You want it in the morning or the afternoon. We go through this process. The first thing is this denial, and you get involved in all these details of making these decisions. And that sort of carries you through the first, but then denial wears off and we feel terribly sad. And we go through a series of psychological moments, including anger, get really angry at God for taking our loved one, angry at our loved one for not taking care of themselves, angry at the doctors for not doing what we wanted, angry at ourselves, guilt for not being closer and not, it's just anger is a way of saying, I'm losing control and it hurts. So if you have a loved one who's really angry after a death, give them a lot more love and let the anger dissipate. And then after anger comes this sort of bargaining kind of thing where if only we say. And then the third thing is just a deep sadness. And we go round and round with these feelings until slowly, slowly we begin to heal and begin to learn to live in the new world without the loved one that we cherish. And what happens after the death, especially before the funeral service, is we have all of these emotions and they come very quickly and they're all mixed up. 1 minute we're pretty clear, taking care of arrangements. 1 minute we're crying hysterically. 1 minute we're angry at everybody. 1 minute we're very sad and can't move. Then we go back around and around. These are the emotions and they're all legitimate. They're all important parts of how we heal from the wound that a death of a loved one imposes on us.
Never mind the questions that come up, like, where is my loved one? When I bury him or her in the casket, what happens to their body? Like, I know as a rabbi, people come to me with tons of questions in that time, and they're burdened with all the tasks that they need to do, but they're literally even more burdened psychologically with all the questions. So what do you say to people who say, we're going to put this body in a casket and bury it in the ground? What happens to my loved one?
Yeah. The first thing I say to them is, let's sit and talk. I like to go and visit a family that's preparing for a funeral. These days since COVID, we do some of these over Zoom, which is not as good as being face to face. But I find that it's so much better if I can come to your home and sit with you in the living room and we can talk face to face. If we can't, by Zoom, it's not so bad either. And we can talk and I can describe to you the rituals of carrying on a funeral and what we do beyond the funeral. And you can ask me all of these questions, because every one of these questions comes at this moment. And, again, because we're not a culture that lives with death on a daily basis the way we once did, this is the time that these questions arise. People who have lived a very long time in the world have never thought about, do I believe in a soul? Do I believe in life after death? Do I believe that somehow the person lives on in the world? Do I believe in judgment? Do I believe in these? What do I believe in? That's when these questions begin to happen. And that's why it's really wonderful to be able to call a family rabbi and say, come over the house, have a cup of tea. Let's talk about these important things together.
And for the person that doesn't have a rabbi, I just want to mention the mortuary, like Hillside, they will provide a rabbi for you. I know that when I was a new rabbi, I was on a list and Hillside would recommend me. And I know that a lot of rabbis do it as a service, and it's just something it's not ideal. You should have a family rabbi, but if you don't have one, you're not out of luck, so to speak.
That's
right?
right.
The mortuary can actually provide you one, but the goal is to really have a rabbi.
Yeah.
So now you've called the mortuary, you've gone over all the details. The date is set for Thursday at 11. What do you need to do?
Oh, good. Well, the first thing you got to do is you want to get your whole family ready to go. And you got to get yourself ready to go, because this is a very difficult thing. And what happens, of course, is that if you're part of a community, if you have a circle of friends, you'll meet them all at the cemetery Thursday at 11. And people will
Do you need to
reach
be
out.
there early though?
Usually you got to be there an hour early.
Right. And the mortuary tells you all that.
They tell you, and you got to sign some papers when you get there.
Yeah, which
Somebody-
people don't know, that you have to
somebody
sign some
has
things
to-
and get a little bit ruffled up about it.
Somebody has to ID the loved one to make sure we're burying the right person. They shouldn't make a mistake.
Do you get a lot of questions like, do you think my loved one will be upset if I don't ID them or if I don't see them in the
Well,
last
the
week?
question is, can we see them? And should we see
Correct.
them? Should we see them? That's the bigger question. Now, Jewish tradition, you probably know, calls for a closed casket. That is to say, it's not respectful to have lots and lots of people looking at somebody if they can't look back. And so we insist that in a public setting, the casket remain closed. But privately, before the service, sometimes loved ones want to spend another minute looking into the face of that loved one. I have to warn you and tell you that the person doesn't look like the one you love. This is where you get this idea of a soul, that it looks like something's missing. So there's the body, and a little bit like grandma or grandpa or mom or dad, but it doesn't look like them because the life force is not there. They're still, they're quiet, they're completely passive, and the life force that gave them animation is not there. So sometimes it can be very disturbing to see the loved one's body.
And it
corpse.
also can be very comforting. I know.
It can be under other circumstances.
Mhm,
It gives us a sense of closure.
mhm.
If you weren't there when the loved one died, believe it or not, it's part of the healing process to be able to see that's the one that I love. There's a story of a friend of mine who lost a mother in a terrible accident. The body was taken by the Chevra Kadisha, and she was so worried. She was tortured with nightmares that Mama might still be alive. And she spoke to one of the members of the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society that prepared her for burial. And the woman said to the burial society, "Was there anything about that woman that you remember?" And the burial society lady said she had the most exquisite fingernails. They were so beautifully painted. And my friend said, "Oh my God, thank you. Now I know it really was Mom that we buried. And I won't be having nightmares that she's out there somewhere without me." And that brought comfort. So sometimes it can bring great comfort. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. Now, I want to just point out one more thing. Friends are going to come. Community members are going to come. Neighbors are going to come. And sometimes they're going to be very comforting. Their presence is comforting. Their hugs are comforting. But sometimes friends, neighbors, associates, they don't know what to say. They just don't know what to say. And they say things, they mean well, they want to help, but they say things that are unintentionally hurtful, unintentionally foolish. And I always ask people, please forgive them. They don't know what to say, and they'll say things that will hurt you. And afterwards, we can sometimes even joke about what are the dumb things that somebody said to you while you lost a loved one. And we recognize that these people have good intentions, but inadvertently, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to show comfort, because in our culture, again, we don't learn how to comfort the mourner, how to comfort the people in grief.
And is there a Jewish way to comfort?
There is. You go up to the person and you say the minimum. I come up to a person and I say, "I'm so sorry for your loss." I try to touch them. I hold their hand. I shake their hand if I feel comfortable enough to give a hug. If I know the person, a word of remembrance. Your mother was such a fine person. She was so, loving. She was giving. She was warm. I'll never forget the time I went to ball games with your dad, or what he taught me when I was young. That word of a connection. I knew your loved one, and your loved one meant something to me. That can be wonderfully comforting. Now,
And I want to,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I wanted to finish out too. After you've identified the body and the service starts, is there someone that conducts the service, or how does it go? They have someone from the mortuary?
So here's the thing. The mortuary director will just give a few instructions. That's when you want a clergy person to lead a service. And the clergy person does something very important. They don't dominate the thing. It's not a show. They simply make room. They make room. Now, here's the point. Bodies die, but spirits don't. Bodies die, but souls don't. The body we prepare for burial and very gently put it into the ground or put it into a crypt in the wall. But the soul, the spirit of a human being, we keep alive by telling stories. And so what a rabbi will do at a service is make room for us to tell stories. I love to invite loved ones to tell a story. And what I tell them to do is very simple. Write your loved one a letter. Dear Dad, this is what I learned from you. Here are the moments when you really touched and shaped my life. Dear Mama, here's what I learned from you. Here's what you gave me that I'll never let go. Dear Grandma, here's why your life meant so much to me. Writing that letter in advance of the funeral is very hard to do. It makes you cry, but it's a holy crying. It's a sacred crying because it's a crying of connection with the soul of the person. And then if you can, you read that letter in front of the community. If not, let the rabbi read it. If not that, then save it for your family. But having written that letter, you're able to say something to the loved one that we so rarely say in life, which is, you matter to me. Your life is immortal because you are impressed into my soul. And I will never forget what you did for me, what you taught me, what you shared with me, how you protected me and supported me. That's what a eulogy, that's the word we use. That's what a hesped, that's the Hebrew word. That's what those words, the telling is. A funeral service is for telling the story so that we cement into our memories what is immortal and eternal about this life. What didn't die? The body died, but the love of my mom, the strength of my dad, the wisdom of my friend, the giving of my grandparent, that never dies. And that's what we get to talk about at a service.
It's so beautiful. And then the director comes back out and he announces that, or she announces that you're going to go to graveside. There's a big question always about pallbearers, who should carry the casket, and then what happens at graveside?
Well, what happens is, so you pick people to carry the caskets are heavier than you think they are.
Very heavy.
So they can be men or women, they can be relatives, they can be the immediate family. I don't recommend the immediate family only because you want to be crying, you want to be grieving. And this is a heavy thing to carry. And it should be people who are relatively sturdy who can carry this thing. We go to graveside, we carry the casket to graveside. If it's a grave in the ground, it's carefully lowered in the ground by the staff of the cemetery. If it's a crypt in the wall, it's carefully put into the wall by the staff of the cemetery. And then the rabbi will do two other things. One, there's a tradition in Jewish life to tear what we're wearing as a sign outwardly that we're mourning, that we're not whole within. It's called kriya, which means tearing. You can tear the clothes you're wearing, give a little knife that helps you, or we can clip a lapel ribbon, a ribbon to your lapel, and we'll tear that. Then the next thing that we're going to do is recite the memorial prayers once again, the Malei Rachamim prayer, and then say the Kaddish prayer. And then in Jewish law and Jewish life, there's a wonderful thing. Just as a child is born into the world into loving hands, when it's our turn to leave the world, it's through loving hands. So we ask the family and everybody present to put a bit of earth into the grave. It's a way of tucking our loved one into the earth. In the same way they tucked us in when we were young and needed protection. We're protecting the body by tucking it into this holy, this sacred, sanctified place. We tuck them in. If it's a crypt in the wall, I always ask the family to bring stones and to put a stone in the crypt as the same way of tucking the loved one in and showing that this is done by the family and by friends, by the community, as a last act of kindness to care for the body and to carry the memory home with us.
People always ask me, do I need to bring my own stones? Do I need to bring my own ribbon? And the funeral home, or in Hillside in this case, provides all that. And everybody is there and has everything. They'll even give you a box to take home with your Yortzeit candle that you light as part of the Shiva. So then people go back to the house and you eat. I mean,
Well,
we joke that Jews eat, but really you eat.
So here's what happens. The Hebrew word for funeral is livaya, which means to accompany. We're accompanying our loved one to their last resting place. And we who are the community, we're accompanying the mourner. Literally, in the ancient temple of Jerusalem, there was a walkway where the mourner would walk, and we would walk with them, and we would meet them, and we would care for them as they walked on that path. Today, our walk is to the cemetery and then coming home. And we who love you, we're your friends, your family, the community, your neighbors. Our job is to remind you that there is something to live for. It is so easy to plant yourself into the cemetery and say, I don't want to live anymore. if I can't live in the world without my loved one. And so we who love you, we're going to take you home, and we're going to surround you with every symbol of life that we can muster. We're going to surround you with friendship and hugs and warmth. We're going to feed you. Someone once quipped that Jews meet catastrophe with carbohydrates, right?
So true.
We're going to feed you. We're going to surround you with memories, with pictures of the loved one, with stories that we cherish. We're going to surround you with children, so you remember there's loved ones to raise yet in the world. And we're going to surround you with words of faith and with prayer, because all of this is a way of making sure that no one gets stuck at the cemetery, that you come home back to the world of the living and take one beginning step away from death and back to life. And that's the process that follows the funeral. It's called in Hebrew Shiva, right? Which means 7. It's 7 days that you're supposed to give yourself to remember the loved one and try to adjust to the new normal. And in those 7 days, you stay close to home. Some people stay away from work. Some people literally stay close to home the whole time. But what it is a time out. It's a time out from the burdens and the routines and the demands of life, so that you can get used to living in this new world. And it's traditional for the community to gather in your home during those days of Shiva, and to bring prayer and to bring food. One of the most beautiful things I've seen in my community is the way that people will they'll organize meal trains. Suddenly there's food coming. People will come, they'll offer memories, they'll offer warmth. We offer prayer together. And slowly, 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 a person heals. Now, healing can take a very long time. It's all subjective. Sometimes healing happens rather quickly because, well, the person's been sick for so long. Death came as a blessing to end the suffering. And so the healing is a relatively simple matter. Sometimes the healing takes a lifetime. It takes a lifetime to heal from a certain kind of death. We give the mourner permission to heal at their own pace, but there's a step-by-step procedure with this. 7 days of Shiva, 30 days of Shloshim, 11 months of saying the Kaddish prayer, and then every year we say the Yizkor prayer 4 times a year. It's a sort of step-by-step healing process that is dictated by tradition, but all of us know that we're going to heal at a different pace and in a different way, and we give the mourner permission to do that.
Oh my God, it's so beautiful, Eddie. I was just going to say, there's so much more that happens, and the questions that are coming in from, if I missed Vidui, if I missed confession, can I say it later? What do I say at the casket? Is there green burials? When do I order the matzeva? These are so many questions that are coming up just from this particular session, which means that we have to have many more. And please write in and tell us all your questions so that we can be a resource for you and Hillside and Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Leder, and Rabbi Dorff. I want to say to you, you are just a gift. Really, I'm not saying this to flatter you. It's the way you walked us just through the burial was so profound. I just wanted to literally take the tape and play it for everybody, because it's just a beautiful way, I think, for rabbis to guide people. I think it's a beautiful way for mortuaries to guide people. I think it's a beautiful way for us to initiate these very difficult conversations, which have to happen. Mm-hmm. So for all of you listening, please send us your questions. You can reach Rabbi Feinstein at vbs.org. You can go to Hillside. We've been posting where to reach them. And of course, come to us, maven.aju.edu, for more incredibly insightful learnings that are very pertinent to your day-to-day life. I hope to have many more series like this. Thank you so much, Rabbi Feinstein. And I want to wish everyone to be well and to stay well.